Welcome to another episode of the Ginger Romance. Here, you'll hear anonymous stories from travellers all over the world. Real submissions from real people. Tales of connection, romance, passion, heartbreak, friendship, and love in all its forms. Because every kind of love deserves to be told. This week on the Ginger Romance, we share a holiday romance set in Warsaw, Poland. This story is a reminder that sometimes the most unforgettable part of a trip isn't the places you travelled to. It's the people you met along the way. Let's get into it. If you'd asked me before that trip what I was hoping to get out of it, I would have given you the most predictable answer imaginable. I wanted to see Europe. Properly. I'd saved for years after university, picked up every extra shift I could, ignored everyone telling me to just buy a car instead, and finally booked myself onto a top deck tour that zigzagged through Central and Eastern Europe. It felt like the safe option. I was travelling solo. The tour company talked a lot about community and inclusivity, which honestly mattered more to me than I admitted at the time. I'd known I was attracted to women for years. A couple of friends knew, my sister knew, but beyond that, I'd become very good at avoiding conversations about relationships altogether. One thing I'd noticed while researching the trip was a small paragraph on their website talking about creating welcoming tours for LGBTQIA travellers. It wasn't a huge statement, just a few sentences, but I remember reading it a few times. Then immediately wondering, well, that's lovely, but will there actually be anyone else like me? It felt silly thinking that way. Europe tours attract hundreds of people. Surely there'd be somebody. Still, when I arrived in London for the welcome meeting, I found myself quietly scanning the room. Not because I was looking to date anyone. I just wanted to know I wasn't the only queer person there. Our group slowly filled the room. Australians, Canadians, Americans, Kiwis, South Africans, a couple from Denmark, a pair of sisters from Ireland. Everyone looked equally exhausted from long-haul flights and equally excited to finally be there. Then she walked in. It's funny what your brain remembers. I couldn't tell you what backpack she had or what shoes she wore, but I remember thinking she somehow looked completely comfortable despite walking into a room full of strangers. She smiled at everyone as though she'd already decided she was just going to enjoy herself. She wasn't conventionally gorgeous in the magazine cover sense. She had messy hair from travelling, little to no makeup, and wore an oversized jumper. But there was something about the way she carried herself that made everyone else seem a little bit blurry. The introduction started. Name, country, what made you book the tour, which destination you were looking forward to most. The standard icebreakers. Afterwards, our guide started handing out room allocations. I wasn't paying much attention until I heard my name, immediately followed by hers. Apparently, we'd be sharing hostel rooms together. I remember thinking, well, that's convenient. By the time we'd dragged our luggage upstairs, we'd already slipped into easy conversation. Where are you from? How long have you been travelling? Favourite food? Worst flight? Nothing remarkable. Some people feel silence because they hate it, but she seemed perfectly happy to let it exist. And oddly, that made talking feel a little bit easier. The next morning, we boarded the train from London to Amsterdam. Most people rushed for window seats. A few couples naturally paired off. Without really discussing it, we ended up sitting beside each other. Crossing into mainland Europe, we spent hours talking. Childhood, families, music, terrible first jobs, books we pretended to finish, our dream destinations. At one point, we laughed so hard that someone across the aisle asked if we'd known each other before the tour. We looked at each other, then answered in perfect sync, no, which somehow made us laugh even harder. Amsterdam was exactly what everybody says it is. Beautiful canals, narrow buildings, bicycles appearing from absolutely nowhere. Our guide packed every day with optional activities: boat cruises, walking tours, museums, markets. Everyone mixed around depending on what interested them. Yet somehow, she and I kept ending up beside each other. Not intentionally, it just happened. One evening, our guide announced that a group wanted to experience Amsterdam's famous red light district. Some people weren't interested. Others treated it like the main event. Curiosity won. I joined. So did she. We wandered through the glowing streets that somehow managed to feel both ordinary and surreal at the same time. Eventually, someone suggested seeing one of the famous live shows. I'd never been anywhere remotely like that. Neither had she. We looked at each other and shrugged. Well, when in Amsterdam. Inside, I expected awkwardness, shock, maybe embarrassment. But instead, something quietly clicked into place. Watching everything unfold on stage, I realised she wasn't looking at the men. Whenever two women performed together, that was where her attention naturally landed. And my attention was on her. Afterwards, we walked back through the city. The group chatted loudly ahead of us. She nudged my shoulder. So, I looked at her. So what? She smiled and said, I think tonight answered a few questions. I laughed and responded, well, it definitely answered one. She hesitated for a second, then quietly admitted, I'm gay. Me too, I answered. I don't think I've ever answered anything faster. There wasn't some big celebration, just two women walking beside a canal in Amsterdam, smiling at each other underneath orange streetlights. And somehow, that tiny conversation became the beginning of everything. The funny thing is, after that conversation in Amsterdam, absolutely nothing changed. And yet, everything did. We never sat down and said, so are we interested in each other? If anything, we became even more relaxed around each other. The pressure disappeared because we'd finally stopped wondering whether the other person understood us. It wasn't about finding another queer woman anymore. It was about finding this woman. The next stop was Berlin. I'd heard so much about the city before we arrived. Its history, its nightlife, its creativity. But what surprised me most was how effortlessly it encouraged our conversation. You couldn't walk through Berlin without bumping into reminders of how people had been divided, misunderstood, or forced to hide parts of themselves. Standing beside remnants of the Berlin Wall, listening to our guide explain how families had been separated overnight, I remember thinking about all the versions of ourselves we keep tucked away because they feel safer hidden. Later that afternoon, we wandered away from the group and found a little cafe tucked down a side street. We spoke about things we'd barely admitted to ourselves. What it was like growing up, crushes we'd pretended weren't crushes, friends we'd convinced ourselves we just admired, the awkwardness of trying to explain why every boyfriend had felt more like an expectation than a choice. There wasn't any sadness in our conversations, mostly relief. It felt like finally speaking a language you'd understood your whole life, but had never been allowed to use it out loud. That evening, a bunch of us went out for dinner before ending up at a rooftop bar overlooking the city. Everyone was swapping stories from home. Some people danced. Some people flirted with the locals. Some disappeared for hours before wandering back to the hostel looking suspiciously cheerful. She and I spent most of the night sitting on a rooftop bench talking about absolutely everything except romance. She knew when to ask another question. She also knew when not to. That's a rare quality. Some people listen because they're waiting for their turn to speak. She listened because she genuinely wanted to understand. Berlin became the city where I realised I looked for her without thinking. Every breakfast, every walking tour, every train platform. If I couldn't immediately see her, my eyes automatically started searching. Not because I was worried, just because she quietly became my favourite part of each day. The tour rolled on toward Poland. Long travel days became our little sanctuary. While everyone else dozed off with headphones in, we'd lean against the windows chatting. Sometimes we'd laugh so loudly, our guide would jokingly tell us to save some stories for everyone else. Other times, we'd just sit in complete silence. People started making comments. Nothing malicious, just the usual observations. You two are attached at the hip. If one of you disappears, the other one won't be far away. You've definitely become tour wives. We laughed it off every time. Warsaw arrived with a crisp air and streets that somehow felt both ancient and brand new. Our guide explained how much of the city had been rebuilt after the war. Walking through the old town almost felt impossible to believe. Everything looked historic, yet so much of it had been painstakingly reconstructed. There's something oddly hopeful about that. The idea that devastation doesn't always get the final word. That evening, the whole group went out for dinner before splitting into smaller circles. Some headed back early, others wanted another drink. Eventually, there were only 6 of us wandering through the old square. Then 4. Then somehow, just the 2 of us. We weren't trying to ditch anyone. It simply happened naturally, like it always seemed to. Street musicians played nearby while people drifted between restaurants and little market stalls. We found ourselves sitting on a stone wall overlooking the square. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, she looked at me and smiled. This trip's gone differently than I expected. Good differently? I asked. The best kind. She looked down at her hands before quietly saying, I've been trying to figure out whether I should kiss you. My heart practically forgot how to function. I've been wondering the same thing, I said. She looked back up. So, I guess one of us should. She leaned in slowly enough that I had every opportunity to move away. I didn't. When we finally pulled apart, we both burst into nervous laughter. I've wanted to do that since Berlin, she said. I've wanted to do it since Amsterdam, I replied. The next morning, nothing felt different, but now there was a secret between us. Not because we were hiding it, just because we hadn't told anyone yet. Turns out, that lasted approximately 6 hours. Apparently, it's impossible to keep something like that from the other observant travellers. One girl looked at us during lunch and simply said, So, finally! The whole table erupted with laughter. We stared at each other and laughed too. Neither of us realised that we'd been so obvious. From there, the tour seemed to settle into an entirely new rhythm. Budapest surprised both of us. The thermal baths became everyone's favourite activity. Floating in warm mineral water while chatting with half the tour somehow felt strangely wholesome. Bratislava became spontaneous detours down quiet streets. Vienna became slow mornings and museums. We explored everything hand in hand. Sometimes we'd intentionally split off for an hour before meeting everyone later. There was never any pressure to label what we were. We both understood the reality. One lived on one side of the world, the other lived on the opposite. This wasn't becoming a long-distance relationship. It was a holiday romance. Beautiful because it had no expectations. Prague arrived like something out of a fairy tale. Morning fog hanging over Charles Bridge, street musicians echoing through narrow laneways, tiny bookstores and hidden courtyards. One day she reached for my hand. I don't want this trip to end. I squeezed her hand. It will. I know, she replied. I said, but maybe that's what makes it special. She smiled sadly. I hate it when you're right. Every country seemed to reveal another layer of who we were. Every train ride meant sharing earbuds and swapping playlists. Every hostel common room turned into another late-night conversation long after everyone else had gone to bed. We still laughed constantly, still teased each other, still challenged each other's opinions. But underneath it all was a growing awareness that time was running out. People often think holiday romances burn brightly because they're intense. I actually think it's because they're honest. You don't have 6 months to play games. You don't wait 3 weeks before saying how you feel. You don't postpone conversations because there'll always be another weekend. Every day matters because every day is one day closer to goodbye. As the train rolled back towards London, everyone became quieter. Phones came out, people swapped photos, started planning reunions, and promised to visit each other. The atmosphere had shifted from excitement to gratitude. When we finally arrived back to where it had all begun, there were hugs everywhere. Tears from people who'd only known each other for a few weeks, but somehow felt like lifelong friends. Throughout the tour, we had talked about continuing our travels and exploring the rest of the UK together. Although the tour had officially ended, neither of us was quite ready for our story to. Leaving the tour behind felt strangely surreal. For 3 weeks, we'd lived by an itinerary someone else had organised. Every morning, there was a meeting point, a departure time, and a guide telling us where to go next. Suddenly, it was just us. 2 backpacks, a rough idea, and 2 weeks with nowhere we needed to be. We caught the train north through England, without much of a plan beyond wanting to travel together for as long as we could. The pace changed immediately. Instead of racing through cities trying to squeeze in every attraction, we'd choose 1 or 2 things each day and leave the rest to chance. We walked through York's narrow medieval streets, ducking into little second-hand bookshops and bakeries simply because they looked inviting. In the Lake District, we hired a small rowing boat, drifting across still water while pretending we knew what we were doing. We spent more time laughing at our terrible rowing than actually moving anywhere. Scotland felt quieter. We spent hours wandering Edinburgh, climbing Arthur's Seat before sunrise one morning simply because we'd both woken early. At the top, the city slowly came alive beneath us. She wrapped her jacket tighter against the cold and said, "I don't think I've ever been this happy." I didn't answer straight away, because I knew exactly what she meant. It was somewhere during those extra weeks that our relationship naturally became more intimate. Not because we'd been waiting for the right moment, but just because it was the first time since we'd met that we finally had privacy. No shared hostel rooms with strangers, no tour schedule, no worrying about whether someone from the group would walk through the door. It happened quietly, naturally, and with complete certainty that this was something we both wanted. Becoming physically close didn't change the foundation we'd already built. The friendship still came first. We still spent hours talking, still challenged each other over silly opinions, still laughed until one of us couldn't breathe over the most ridiculous observations. The romance never replaced the friendship. It simply grew out of it. We travelled through Wales almost entirely by train, watching rolling green hills disappear outside the window while trying to decide which place had been our favourite so far. We never reached an answer. Every country seemed to represent a different chapter of whatever this had become. Amsterdam was discovery. Berlin was honesty. Warsaw was courage. Scotland was comfort. Ireland eventually became acceptance. In Galway, we found a tiny pub with live traditional music where neither of us knew the songs, yet somehow we stayed until closing time. Walking back to our accommodation that night, she reached for my hand. "You know this ends in London. Are you okay with that?" I thought about it for a while before answering, and then said, "I think I'd be more upset if we'd spent this whole trip pretending not to feel anything." She smiled and said, "I've been thinking the same thing." That became the unspoken agreement between us. No impossible plans, no pretending we'd somehow solve living on opposite sides of the world. We weren't avoiding commitment. We were just respecting reality. People often assume that that's sad, but I don't think it was. In some ways, Removing the pressure allowed us to appreciate every remaining day instead of worrying about what came afterwards. Eventually, those 2 extra weeks disappeared just as quickly as the tour had. We found ourselves back in London, the exact same city where we'd first met. The same station, the same underground lines, the same busy streets. Except neither of us were the same people anymore. We checked into an airport hotel the night before our flights. Mine left early in the morning. Hers wasn't until later in the afternoon. Neither of us slept particularly well. We talked instead, about everything except saying goodbye. What were our favourite moments? Which was the worst hotel? Who was the funniest person on the tour? The city we want to return to first. Morning arrived much faster than either of us wanted. We hugged for what felt like an unusually long time. We shared one last kiss, one last smile. Then I walked off towards the train. I turned around twice. She was still standing there watching me walk away. Each time, we just smiled at each other. The kind of smile that's trying very hard not to become tears. For the first few months afterwards, we messaged constantly. Every photo we'd forgotten to send. Every joke we'd remembered later. Songs that reminded us of our train rides. But time zones made things harder. Life became busier. She started a new job, and I threw myself back into my work. The daily messages slowly became weekly, then monthly. Now, every now and then, one of us will send a photo from somewhere we've travelled, or we'll wish each other a happy birthday. Sometimes we'll spend an hour catching up before disappearing into our own lives again. People ask whether I regret not trying to make it work. My honest answer is not at all. If I could go back and relive those 5 weeks, knowing they'd still end exactly the same way, I'd book the ticket again tomorrow. That's where the story ends, but not where my thoughts do. I love how this story challenges the idea that if a romance doesn't end in getting married or growing old together, then somehow it failed. These 2 women never promised forever and are a prime example of how wonderful a holiday romance can be. It's proof that there can be extraordinary return on something temporary. So I'm curious, do you think we are putting too much pressure on every great love to become a lifelong one? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll catch you in next week's episode. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following along to keep up to date with weekly stories that will inspire, entertain, and maybe even make you fall in love with the idea of love itself. Got your own romance story and want to be a part of the Ginger Romance community? Check the notes for details on how to submit your own.